This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 325 of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast, and this episode was recorded live from Odell Brewing Sloan's Lake as part of our recent brewery workshop New Brewery Accelerator event in Denver, Colorado. The three-panel guests, Jake Gardner, Director of Brewing Ops for Westbound Down, Marnie Walquist, Head Brewer for Odell Brewing Sloan's Lake, and Sean Buchan, Owner and Head Brewer for Cerebral Brewing, represent a compelling cross-section of IPA from Denver and the Rocky Mountain region. Of course, all three brewers have GABF medals to their name, and Westbound Down is fresh off of their 2023 gold in West Coast IPA and a silver in New Zealand IPA, this most recent Great American Beer Festival. Can't wait to share their panelists' thoughts on brewing IPA with you. But first, G&D Chillers, the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling, are proud of the cool partnerships they've built over the past 30 years. G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, and reliability with 24/7 service and support. Want to maximize efficiency in your chiller? G&D's micro-channel condensers are designed for less power draw. Their lighter weight and more compact design uses up to 70% less refrigerant, which means a lower GWP and lower operating costs. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com or call to discuss your next project. Also, this episode is sponsored by BSG, North America's exclusive distributor of Weyermann Specialty Malts. For over 140 years, Weyermann Specialty Malts has been helping brewers around the world bring authentic German flavor to their brew houses. From caramel malts to the Barca line and heirloom barley varieties, Weyermann's malts are sought after and celebrated for their performance and their flavor. Bring a taste of Bavaria to your brew house and explore Weyermann's complete portfolio at bsgcraftbrewing.com/Weyermann. And is your brewery making its own ciders, seltzers, and other beverages beyond beer? If you need a central source for fruit flavor, Old Orchard has you covered. Old Orchard supplies flavored craft juice concentrate blends to beverage brands for the production of beer, cider, seltzer, wine, spirits, kombucha, and more. Flavor your lineup and streamline your sourcing by heading to oldorchard.com/brewer. And now, on to the panel discussion on IPA. On my far left, Marnie, head brewer here for the Odell Sloan's Lake location. Welcome, Marnie.
Hello.
Second over here, Jake Gardner, head brewer. Is that your director of brewing ops? It's director of brewing ops, exactly, for Westbound Down. You may know him from a recent craft beer and brewing video class on brewing IPA for longevity. If you're an all-access subscriber to Craft Beer and Brewing. If you haven't watched that yet, you absolutely should. And Jake just won a few medals at the GABF, including gold medal for West Coast IPA. No small feat. Congratulations, Jake.
Woo! Cheers to that.
And then right next to me here is Sean Buchan. Sean is the co-founder of Cerebral Brewing. One of the most progressive, forward-looking IPA brewers here in Denver, Colorado, and a thoughtful maker of Hazy IPA and other progressive styles. Also a lager maker, and so it's not like we can't just pigeonhole you into that, even though we might have you.
Can we talk about Saison today, too?
No, we can't talk about Saison. This is about IPA, about IPA today. And so we're going to keep this open to questions. Like I said, throw your hand up if you've got a question about IPA brewing. The reason we want to focus this session, this discussion on IPA is that IPA is such a humongous chunk of the American craft beer market. You know, by all of the Nielsen numbers, by all the aggregate numbers, over 40% of the entire craft beer market. And when I say craft beer market, it is craft beer market. And 40% of that market is IPA. And so as we look at it, what IPA means today is different than what IPA meant in 2015, and what IPA meant in 2015 is different than what IPA meant in 2010. we're seeing very rapid change around that. And I don't just mean, hazy versus clear. I mean, even within these segments, we're seeing rapid change within West Coast IPA, within Hazy IPA, consumer patterns around double IPA. The technology around producing hoppy beers is improving and at a pace that we have never before seen in history. The products that are available, the formats that are available, the interaction with growers to optimize for flavors that brewers really want in IPAs, we have never seen it in the way that we have now. And so that is the kind of foundation, for this panel right now. Let's get this, this conversation about IPA started, with kind of a state of the union. From your perspective, Sean, what does IPA mean now for Cerebral Brewing? How do you all think about IPA? How important is IPA to your brewery? And what lanes are you now channeling IPA into in your brewing plan?
So we started making Hazy IPA when we opened in 2015. That was really the predominant amount of, that was our main focus on IPA. I came from a home brewing background and really wanted to push in that direction because there were not many, at the time, any producers doing that in the state. I think with where we're at right now, it's quite the opposite. I think everybody has kind of leaned into that. And we've, like many people, gone the opposite direction, really focusing on honing our technique in West Coast or taking the things that we learned from hops and adapting that into lager production or Saison production that we can't talk about. But I think we make, I would say, 30% of our annual production of about 4,500 barrels is our core Hazy IPA rare trait. I don't know the exact numbers on the total production that we do of Hazy IPA, but it's probably 60% easy of what we do. But West Coast IPA is really gaining a lot of momentum. We've been producing a lot more of that. I would say, we're still probably under 10% in that. But I think in terms of state of the union, things that we're seeing right now, Jamie alluded to, a lot of what we're really focused on right now is achieving the best possible quality that we can in the IPAs that we make. So there's so many products that it's really tempting to kind of grab at everything. Look at, okay, this new product came out, let's use that. Let's use this. Phantasm was big a few years ago. Now there's Sub-Zero Hop Keef. It can be a little bit of ADHD where you're just looking around at new things. So it's taken a lot for us to find avenues to experiment with new products and new techniques while also taking the lessons learned there and adapting that into our core lineup and our core brands so that that's ever evolving and ever growing in terms of quality and just flavor progression.
Jake, in terms of State of the Union, how are you all approaching IPA? You brew hazy and clear. How have you found kind of flavor families that resonate with your audiences and connect in a way that make the beers that you want to make as Westbound and Down beers?
At Westbound, State of the Union, I'd say the state of IPA is strong. We basically make IPA and lager. We have a seasonal porter, and we have a pretty strong barrel-aged beer program, as well as this guy too. But, beers that aren't lager or IPA collectively only represent 10% of what we do, and lager represents a quarter approximately of what we do. And the rest is IPA. So we're making, 55 to 65% IPA between Hazy and West Coast styles. Our number one selling beer is our Hazy IPA Juice Caboose, followed very closely by Westbound IPA, which is our house West Coast IPA. We're hopheads. I mean, even when we make lager, we dry hop the hell out of it. So, we're a very hop-focused brewery. But I'd say all that being said, I think, Westbound's kind of carved out a niche of being a very hop-focused brewery, and our customer base knows that about us. Even if we're going to make German lager, German Pilsner, people are going to, I think people expect us to over-bitter it and consider dry hopping it, although we don't. But I've thought about it. So yeah, I think IPA is what Westbound does, and I think for the most part, it's still the focus of a ton of craft beer drinkers. I was in an Uber on the ride over here. The very nice gentleman that moved here from Oregon. He told me about he's a cricket player. He told me about his passion for McMenamins, Hammerhead. He's like, why am I taking you to a brewery? I told him this was all going to happen. And he's like, oh, I needed, try your IPA. All he drank was IPA. This is completely unsolicited. He just saw I was going to Odell and then told me all this info. So, anecdotal, but I do think just in general, people who connect with craft beer are still connecting with hoppy beer styles the most because it feels like of things that are highly consumable, it's the opposite of macro beer. So I think that's how I fell in love with it. And I think a lot of people who fall in love with craft beer will follow that trajectory. And I think that explains its dominance in the craft beer sector.
Sure. Marnie, Odell has this long history with Odell IPA that dates to the mid-2000s, a long award-winning history and one that has garnered lots and lots of respect. What does IPA now mean for Odell in today's context? How much does it figure into it? And, what does it now look like for Odell?
We're still very IPA focused. And as far as, we here at our location alone, we are mostly brewing IPAs as far as that's what everyone wants. And also with our packaged beer lineup as well, it's something that is one of our solid sellers is the Elephant IPA, I'd say.
You call it Elephant
We do.
IPA.
We do call it Elephant IPA. And then we do have a few other IPA offerings as well that are very strong behind it, but I would say our Elephant is still very strong. People do like that clear, the clear hoppy IPA. On another note, with hops, I think that like what Jake said, bringing the flavors to people, and it is the polar opposite of domestic beers. And something that we do is we push the boundaries with bringing new hops out as well by sponsoring hops. And like 638 and 586 are some of the hops that we have sponsored in the past to bring to everyone to brew with. So we do love hop development as well.
Well, let's come back to that because that's an interesting, and that's a whole nother level of hop love and focus. But tell me a little bit, from here on the brew house at Sloan's Lake, which is not the main production brew house up in Fort Collins, but is built to feed beers here in the Denver market, primarily for this tap room. What percentage of the beers that you brew out of this tap room here or this brew house here are IPA?
I'd say easily 60% of the beers we brew are IPA. Our Hazy is definitely our strong mover, but again, like Jake said, our West Coast clear beers are also they suddenly just turned on. I would say in the past year, we've seen a big uptick with that, and it's been really fun to see because I love clear IPAs, so it's really exciting.
Hell yeah.
We'll be back with more from the panel in a minute, but first, take your brewing to the next level with AccuBrew's revolutionary fermentation monitoring system, now predicting specific gravity. With AccuBrew, you'll have precise control over the fermentation process and ensure consistent, high-quality results. Their cloud-based app and compact sensor work together to monitor specific gravity, fermentation activity, clarity, and temperature. AccuBrew is CIP ready and designed to stay out of your way. Their set-it-and-forget-it solution streamlines systems and processes, confirms consistency, and helps detect problems before they ruin a batch. Join the AccuBrew community today and experience 24/7 peace of mind. Visit accubrew.io to learn more. Also, ProBrew is excited to announce that they are currently featuring short lead times between 2 and 4 weeks for their in-stock ProFill rotary can fillers. These can fillers run at speeds between 100 and 600 plus cans per minute, while achieving precise and consistent filling volumes not achievable by most inline and mobile fillers. For more information, fill out their contact form on www.probrew.com or email contactus@probrew.com to learn exactly how they can take your operations to the next level. ProBrew, brew your beer. Now, back to the panel. We're not going to take sides in the clear versus hazy. I think there are customers.
I still love a good hazy, but
I think there are customers for both, and
Absolutely.
there are flavor cases for both. And smart breweries are probably making both to make customers happy. Having said that, today's West Coast IPA, today's clear IPA, has absolutely benefited from techniques that brewers have learned through brewing hazy beer, and vice versa. These things, I think, exist in a dialogue with each other. They don't exist in their own silos or separate from each other. Jake, talk to me about what you have learned, what you've taken from making hazy IPA that may have impacted some of the techniques that you now apply to West Coast IPA.
Yeah, I think modern West Coast IPA exists solely as a reaction and kind of from a place. It wouldn't exist without hazy IPA. I think a lot of the nuance with playing with yeast, both thiol and other biotransformation kind of flavors, working with super fruit-forward hops and trying to express those flavors, and even as simple as just learning to dial back bitterness to express other hop characteristics at the forefront are things that no one thought of in 2014 or 2015. And I was certainly making a lot of hoppy beer then as well. But a lot of the approach to it, even before I was making hazy IPA, a lot of the thought process around kind of what has become this like wave 3 of West Coast IPA, I'd say comes from things learned in hazy IPA production. I mean, at the core of any of these, whether you're making hop forward West Coast Pilsner or whether you're making, any of these very hop forward beers, utilizing hops with yeast, mid fermentation, early fermentation, or in tertiary, those translate between beer styles. So I think, that is my passion is West Coast IPA. That being said, like literally to remind everybody when we go to hop selection, you have to have with YCH a passcode to get into all your results, and ours is to remind everybody why we're at hop selection. It's because we make a whole lot of hazy IPA also. So these things are intertwined, and you learn a ton.
I'm gonna hack your account now that you've shared that information.
Shit, I guess I shouldn't have said that. But
no, we'll edit that out.
All you could learn is which hops we selected this year, so not a lot to learn from hacking that, but please don't hack our thing. I got to change the password now.
Do you guys select differently for your, do you select the same lot of Simcoe for everything, or are you able to split it a little bit between East Coast and West Coast?
Great question. I dream of getting big enough to do that, but in general, no. We selected 2 lots of Citra this year for that reason. Other than that, no. And we're actually holding back some 22 Citra that we think is better as a hazy IPA Citra. But no, I do know, like buddies at Ghost Town and some places that are, in this double lot selection, they'll even select 2 lots of stuff just to make different West Coast IPA, and very jealous of that production level, but we're in the mid 4,000 barrels. So even using, 6+ total pounds probably on average for beer still doesn't put us in selecting 2 Simcoes.
If you want more on that, I did a podcast episode with Justin from Ghost Town. He does talk about using different selections of the same hops in order to add that contrast. You can start thinking about them as different hops in that regard. Sean, from your perspective, making you all make West Coast IPA, but also focus on hazy IPA maybe more than West Coast IPA. How does that interplay between the two impact the way that you all construct beers?
Yeah, I guess first of all, I agree with everything that Jake said before. again, we're predominantly hazy IPA focused, but our brewers get the most excited about when we get to design new West Coast IPAs. And we're trying our best to really, like, every time we get new hops in, new lots in, we're big enough to be able to do selection. So, we're selecting lots and really looking at it. Same thing across the board. There's some things that we are able to split out. We go with some smaller providers. Hollingberry has let us split out some things. We have been fortunate with that, but in general, I think we really look at both from the same viewpoint where, we're trying it more than anything to achieve hop saturation. And you have to just consider what your variables are. So in East Coast IPA, hazy IPA, you're looking at higher final gravity. You're looking at driving a lot more sweetness, a lot more tropical fruit. You're trying to maybe balance in a little bit more of that dank OG note so that it is not one-dimensional. And then you're doing almost the reverse of that when we craft a West Coast IPA. So we're looking at hops that play really well. And thank you for sponsoring 586, by the way. That's one of our favorite West Coast IPA hops, but it works in both. And I think we try to find hops that play in both spaces where it can, it can give you that sulfur. It can give you a little bit of that onion garlic that you want as a complementary note. You can look for, passion fruit and all these things that you want, but you need to find balance. And then, knowing that we're going to look for a much lower final gravity and a little bit crispier finish, different water chemistry, and just trying to blend those hops to the final target, but still in both directions, looking for as much hop saturation as we can provide. We use a good amount of flowable hop products in both, and I think we're translating everything that we learn in East Coast IPA and trying to find ways to insert that into West Coast. It might be a slightly different application, but all in all, same goal: as much hop saturation as we can provide in that beer.
Which flowables are you using right now, and where?
We use a lot of incognito, and we do the Kelsey at North Park method, where we do the hot knockout method. We do that both on East Coast hazy IPAs and West Coast IPAs. We do a little bit of Spectrum in dry hop right now. We're experimenting with that with pretty good results for a 11 to 22 pound hop dry hop replacement, and then we just started playing around with the Freestyle New Zealand, Sub-Zero Hop Keef, and I love that because it's cold side and liquid and flowable and helps with yield and everything. So
sweet. I love that Kelsey gets to take credit for that technique.
Yeah, we heard it from Cellarmaker first, but then he popularized it with you. So I don't know.
Did I popularize it? I think it was Vinny that has been popularizing Kelsey as the source of that. So nonetheless, Marnie, why don't you talk to us about your current IPA development strategy? As you're making 60% of IPAs here at the Odell Sloan Lake, and also understanding that Odell has a weight of history behind it, right? An expectation. Sure. People, when they come for an Odell IPA, it has to be good because it's Odell. It has to be a good IPA. Your Elephant IPA is one of the gold standards of IPA in the world today. And so, how do you then, take that and find creative space to think about new iterations on IPA? What are those things that start driving your decision-making in creating new IPAs?
Sure. Well, like Jake and Sean said about the hazy actually pushing those boundaries to the West Coast, I kind of feel like sometimes I'm on an island down here, being away from the big brew house and knowing what's going on up there. And so I get to play a lot, which is a lot of fun. As far as flowables, don't use a lot of those. I have to say we do use quite a bit of cryo down here, and then the T90s and some T70s as well. But I have personally my West Coast styles of IPA have been very influenced by brewing the hazy IPA, and that was a very organic process that kind of came about. and then being out and drinking some of IPAs around town, some Westbound Cerebrals and others, and seeing that the IPAs are, especially the clear West Coast, are changing quite a bit from that. And I also think not just the hops that we're talking about, I think also the malts have also changed a little bit, because the Elfin IPA is a little bit more hoppy, I think, of an offering than some of the more modern IPAs, West Coast IPAs that are coming out now. They're definitely lighter malts. I've noticed that. But yeah, that's probably the biggest thing is, just everything playing off each other, and, letting those hops and raw materials guide me and what I do back there. Yeah.
Sure. Let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about, malt and building. Like, what you say is absolutely correct. Today's West Coast IPA is more lean than it's ever been.
Yeah.
And lean, I don't know that describes it entirely. Like, it's pale,
Yeah,
but
the
it still
color.
has to have a body to it to support, this heavy hop load. So how do you start thinking of, in terms of creating a beer, how you build body without building a lot of weight to it, but still have it hold up to these very, very heavy hop loads?
I look at, let's see. The way I build body is I do like to use a little bit of wheat in there. And
What's a little bit?
I would say maybe it's pretty small. It's like 5%. And I do rely on the base malt. I think the base malt, also having some rest temperatures along the way helps in building that malt character and keeping it really light.
Yeah.
And to be able to show off the hops. And I think that's the beauty that Hazy has brought the West Coast IPA, is like you can brew it lighter and you can still have that, you have that light malt backbone where the hops can still shine and still use quite a bit. And I find that having a few rests along the way during conversion really helps with, creating a little bit more depth in there with the malts. Personally,
Sure.
yeah.
Sure. Jake, how do you do it?
My answer is going to be kind of boring. I do love the wheat. We're usually 5-10% white wheat. I don't think there's a wrong answer in choice of that. We use raw white wheat, but we've used Breeze, and can't say that has any of the magic formula. But I think the biggest thing is we try to make the driest beer possible. I mean, generally across the board. So we are, mashing it at 148 to 150 on West Coast IPA, no mash out rest. Some old school American brewers used to say, you mash in, you go smoke a cigarette, and then you start runoff. I don't smoke cigarettes, so I don't do that, but I am impatient. And we basically mash in at 148 to 150, wait 15 minutes if I'm feeling extra patient that day, and then start verloffing and running off. No mash out rest. We're still converting the whole time. And when we make, 15 Plato West Coast IPA, we want those beers to finish. Like we think we have screwed up if they finish above 2 Plato. 1.4 to 1.6 is target. 1.8 is acceptable. These are excessively dry beers. And then I think, tying back into learning from Hazy IPA, making beers that had a first word addition and then all Whirlpool was unthinkable in 2015, and now is basically all of our West Coast IPA additions is 20 to 35 IBUs from a first word or a 90-minute addition, and then a massive Whirlpool charge, 2 to 3 pounds per barrel, and that's the beer. So we're Pilsner malt people. I think I've talked with Jamie about this before. I think picking malts that lower fan content is something that, as you're building recipes and starting a business is something, especially if you're a package brewery is something you should be focused on. If you're not, which I wasn't for a very long time, you can get away with murder. If you're selling your beer in 38 days over the bar, all cold stored in kegs, which you should do in your business plan regardless on the cold storage part, don't worry about anything I just said about free amino nitrogen. But if you're planning on putting those beers in package, I think that's a huge part of what we focus on is how do these beers taste great for more than a minute. And especially if you're going to put that excessive amount of hops in it, is, somebody going to bring home a 4-pack. Maybe they don't drink as much as I do, and then it takes them a month to drink. I don't know who these people are, but apparently they exist. You got to think about these things, is how great can this beer be in 60 days or 70 days? So those are the things we consider. And I think, in West Coast IPA or Hazy IPA, playing with bitterness and finishing gravity is a key to, kind of the voice you want to create with the beer you make. So, for us, that's lean on the IBUs and very dry on the West Coast. And even on the hazies, like, we might add a little more IBUs than some, but we're bio-fining those beers and we're very low. We were talking before, we're very low on the kind of hop burn character. I'm not a fan of in Hazy IPA. Like, that's not our kind of voice and direction as a company in that beer style. So I think just finding that balance between dryness and hop expression and bitterness is kind of the interplay of where we're thinking about those things.
How dry are your hazies?
Not dry.
Okay.
Like 3.6 to 4.
Good. Just curious.
Sure. And if you want to learn more from Jake on the subject of free amino nitrogen and longevity in packaging, we've got a great class again from one of our all access video classes where he goes into great depth around that. And so definitely learn more about there. But this is an interesting question. I mean, I think we've all noticed, that we have, in this day and age, eliminating those things like, caramel and crystal malts from IPA, it just seems like something we do. Now IPA is very pale, that there's an expectation, but those also seem to hold on to hop flavor longer. Sean, from your perspective in brewing Hazy IPA, how have you adjusted grists in order to hold on to and amplify, those bright, expressive, fruity hop characters, even in the hazy space?
Yeah, I think we've gone about it a number of different ways since we started about 8 years ago. So when we craft Hazy IPAs, we have actually taken some of the things we've learned from West Coast and brought it back to Hazy. So we are a predominantly Pilsner malt brewery. We use that in West Coast IPA. We use that in Hazy IPA. I will admit part of that is just simplicity of using, the same base malt. We've gone back and forth. We didn't notice enough of a difference to really need to keep splitting orders. So we like the quality that we get with our Pilsner malt. That's usually around 70% of the grist. And then we layer in enough body where we're layering in oats in the form of flaked oats, golden naked oats, and occasionally malted oats. And using a lot of that along with a good proportion of white wheat, and trying to make sure that we're not overpowering the hops. So you're trying to really, I think there was a moment in Hazy IPA where the sweetness was really, really driving, and I think that is what led to a big resurgence in West Coast IPA, is that some of these Hazy IPAs were getting so sweet and so like thick from a mouthfeel perspective that, you could not have more than one of those. So I think luckily we stayed pretty true to like the down the middle Hazy IPA. We finish about 3.5 to 4 Plato, so a pretty similar final gravity to what Jake was talking about. But really, you don't want to build in enough malt flavor and sweetness that you're competing with hops. But I think that happens quite a bit in the style. So that's a lot of what we focus on, is really trying to drive clean malt flavor where it is present, where you notice it, but it doesn't get in the way, and then you're able to take that hop charge that you're doing. It's similar. We do a lot of IPAs now that honestly don't have any hop additions until we're doing Whirlpool hops. And even then, that number is diminishing as we're loading in a little bit more incognito, doing some things cold side to drive more bitterness. So trying to just play with that space, but while keeping that bitterness in both styles really in check. You want that bitterness to be approachable, but not offensive. You want to layer in the bitterness that you are anticipating to get, whether it's we're not measuring IBUs very often. We do it from a lab perspective every once in a while to make sure our system's in check. But we're not really measuring that. We're looking at, like, I guess, how we perceive that bitterness. So making sure that that's in check for both West Coast IPA, obviously a higher threshold there, and then East Coast IPA, bitter enough where you're not just driving sweet on sweet, where I think a lot of the new hops that we're using in these can push you in that direction. It can push you in just lychee and passion fruit and tangerine and all these sweet things, and you need something to counter that. So I think that's where we're focused.
We'll keep the conversation going in a minute, but first, you like wildly aromatic IPAs and tropical lagers? Good thing Omega designed thiolized yeast for just that reason. Thiolized yeast are a new tool for brewers to bring intense guava and passion fruit aromas out of your malt and hops. And wait, there's more. Omega yeast makes yeast to order with a consistent 1-week lead time, ensuring peak freshness and reliability. Also, who doesn't love free samples? The Perfect Puree is offering a free sample box of their frozen fruit purees, concentrates, and blends to professional brewers. Picked at the peak of ripeness, their fruit is pureed and frozen for optimal fresh flavor and color. Explore classics from red raspberry and blood orange to unique fruit juice blends such as Yuzu Lux Sour. Choose from 40-plus flavors and build a free sample box at perfectpuree.com/beer. That's perfectpuree, PUREE.com/beer. Complimentary to professionals only. And this episode is sponsored by Yakima Chief Hops. Yakima Chief Hops launched Varieties Supply Company, their own brand of hop apparel inspired by hop varieties, art, and community. Shop designs from various artists inspired by your favorite varieties, including Citra, Simcoe, Sabro, and the Mosaic collection that just dropped. With sustainability in mind, Varieties strives to provide socially and environmentally conscious merchandising featuring artwork by a diverse group of illustrators. Shop Varieties and use promo code CBB20 for 20% off at Varieties. That's VARIETEES.com. Now, back to the panel. Is Hazy IPA today getting more bitter, in that regard? Or how are consumers perceiving that? Is that a real thing?
In my opinion, I feel like it's honestly leveling out now. When it started, I can still remember some of those Trillium 22-ounce bombers, and they were bitter. They were very bitter. And I think when it moved across the country, it kind of happened in waves. And I'm sure it's not the same as, us drinking European beer that's obviously not super fresh, but it's funny how people interpret, like, okay, this 8-week-old can of Treehouse or Trillium is what it's like in New England. It's not. So I don't know if that's what led to it, but as it swept across the country, I feel like residual gravities crept up and sweetness just kept pushing, and body kept going up and up. And I think it hit a critical mass where we couldn't sustain that anymore. And it wasn't, really engaging to customers. It wasn't allowing people to really want to go back for that second, third pour, which is what you should strive for, especially in the taproom model. You want to create a beer you can finish the pint of or the 10-ounce pour of, and then you want to go back to either that beer or a similar beer. You don't want to push people like, okay, I had my beer here, I'm going to leave. That's not going to do well for your bottom line. So I think over the past few years, I feel like it's leveled off. I think, you have a lot of people that are entering the space that are doing this at a really high level, and that bitterness is balanced and approachable. And there's some makers that are, going to be super high and super low, but in general, I think it's pretty static right now.
Just to jump in and say one thing, I think one thing that Sean is talking about that I think is a truism about American craft beer more broadly is that I think an American craft beer, at least, from my experience in the last, 15 years of being involved as a drinker and 12 or 11 or something like that professionally, I think American craft beer often is a caricature of the real thing. Like, we didn't have a real thing to start with. Like, the Europeans had long histories of beer styles they had invented that had been there that were like, how your grandmother made tomato soup or something. Like her mom made it, and then she made just the exact same. And they have that. We didn't. So everything was like an interpretation. And then I think the human brain just can only have but so many bullet points to define what something is. And then it's kind of like a game of telephone, which is kind of what you're describing as it moved across the country. So it's like it was less bitter, I think, potentially even that bomber of Trillium beer than the other IPA equivalent. And then people kept imitating that. And then people were drinking the imitation and not the Trillium bomber in this example. And then at some point, it just became a not bitter beer. It's like cool pool only at 180 degrees. Whatever IBUs that is, that's the beer. And I think, West Coast IPA has kind of done the same. It's like, you saw this whole trajectory of, restrained bitterness made it modern. And now you're kind of seeing this resurgence of people bringing back some real IBUs to the beer style. It seems to be some kind of like group think or I don't know how to describe it, but it does happen in waves like that in craft beer. And it's something to just be aware of like, I think one thing at Westbound we always talk about is like having our own voice in whatever to try to cut through the noise of realizing we're subject to moving beer trends that are moving really quick and other people are imitating the imitation. So these things like just swing all around. And it's something we think about a lot of like, are we changing because we believe in this? Or are we changing this because this is other people are changing and it's what's around us? And both can be true at once, but it's just something to consider as you're opening a brewery or making beer is that I think American craft beer just moves very quickly in pendulums because there's a lot of copies of copies that play a game of telephone almost like, with your kindergartner or whatever.
Trends are something that I think it's probably one of the most common questions you all have, or at least I would have as someone coming in to try to establish a brewery. But it's something that you have to be wary of where it's like, we need to look in that direction, but not just use that as your North Star. So I think like we align 100% with what Jake said about having a voice and a vision and something that we strive for as a brand, and then trying to stay true to that, whether that is aligned or not aligned with where things are going at the moment.
As we're talking about bitterness, like all bitterness is not the same, right? Our ability to convey bitterness in beers has developed. Marnie, how does Odell approach the idea of bitterness, not just in terms of numerical values, but also in the way that human beings actually perceive that bitterness? Because there is bitterness that feels cohesive and pleasant, and there's bitterness that feels rough and ragged. And today bitterness needs to feel smooth no matter what, no matter what the intensity level is of it. How do you all approach that from an Odell perspective?
We look at it with, the different hops offer a different kind of bitterness. And there's just hops that we prefer, if we're going to put any hops in a boil, we would, maybe not prefer to use something like a Chinook in the boil. Or, I've found recently that I kind of do like a little bit of Amarillo in the boil. I think it imparts a little bit of herbal quality, maybe not necessarily for an IPA. It might be something like a Saison or something, but just a little bit.
Everyone's trying to talk about Saison. We're supposed to talk about IPA here. Come on.
I promise you I won't talk about Saison.
But it is something, and there is a different qualities of bitterness. And whenever I have a new hop, recently I used a little bit of 638 recently on hot side just to see, and the bitterness is all right, but it doesn't really fulfill what I'm looking for in a bitterness. It kind of rides a higher note of bitterness, maybe a little bit aggressive. And so, maybe for instance, like Simcoe has a nice bitterness and that can offer hot side, but things just like that, there are different types of bitterness and things, might impart with the hops, it's not just bitter. You're going to get some other flavors from the hops.
Sure, Jake. How do you all approach bitterness and the quality of bitterness these days?
Yeah, the Germans have a term called fine bitterness. Is it? And talking with good friends at Beer Shot Lager House who do not make any IPA, but they will tell you that is a confusing term, mainly because it is totally subjective. Like when bitterness feels enjoyable and palatable is hard to describe, but it's something when you drink a lot of beer, which I think everyone on this panel seems to do. I certainly do. You can drink beers and you make a lot of different beers with a lot of different bittering hops. Simcoe is the go-to at Westbound. I think if I were to give any advice on making West Coast IPA, I would just say, Simcoe. Play around in the whirlpool and then dry hop the hell out of it, and you're probably halfway to pretty decent IPA. But there's a ton of theory and on why Simcoe works. You're looking for these low cohumulone levels. We actually.
What do you mean by that, Jake?
What I mean by that is hydrocarbon fraction of hop oils will be like the woody, earthy kind of characters of hops. And so, like, for example, Centennial is a hop that we do not like to use hot side at Westbound. And I'm not saying it can't be sprinkled in if you're trying to end a contract or something, but we describe it as pencil shavings. And you can pick it up in, and I say that from experience of picking some Centennial and trying to end a contract. Like, how much of this can we use to get rid of it without it impacting our flavor of our beer? But we get this, like, literally visceral memory of childhood where, I'm sure no kids now will have this experience because they're on, computers, but the pencil sharpener and the aroma that came off of that is like a Centennial hot side hop thing. And it's a high hydrocarbon fraction hops, myrcene, amongst other things you can look up. But anyway, it gives that woodsy character, and it also at a high level is harsh. At a low level, you're saying pencil shavings. If you're bittering your beer throughout with that, we get that kind of like harsh, grippy, like am I sick kind of throat character. Yeah. Replace all that with Simcoe, and all of a sudden you're just like, it almost has like a salt quality where like the bitterness, just the response to it is, I need more liquid. And that's rolling this to make money. Like, that's the response you want, not like, am I sick while drinking beer? That's horrible. Or this causes me to want to drink more beer. That's something we should, harness, because you can write a business plan around that. So combine all those. Not saying Simcoe is the only one, but it is the secret sauce in both styles of IPA for us on the hot side.
Sure. Sean, so for many years now, you all have made really compelling IPAs. You just, this past season, started selecting hops. So for many years of Cerebral, you were able to make compelling hoppy beers without selecting hops. Talk to, like, for all of these breweries and planning that are listening right now, what were some of the strategies that you used to maximize the quality of the hoppy beers that you made, knowing that you didn't necessarily have that tool of selection in your toolbox?
I guess one point of clarification, I was misleading when I was talking to you before. We have selected in previous years. This is our first year going to hop selection.
Going to hop selection. Okay.
So the first year that we were, thank you, looking out. The first year we were able to select truly based on quantities for a lot of our contracts was 2020. So that year we didn't make it out, obviously. The next year we didn't make it out. Last year our head brewer had a baby. I didn't want to go by myself, and it was just not a good staffing year. We're turning on the new system. So we did remote selection for the past 3 years. So I'd say even before that, I can still offer, I guess, some advice from what we've done before that. It has benefited us tremendously. So again, our barrelage right now is 4,500 barrels a year. We are not a large brewery by any means, especially in this state. Before that, I think before COVID, we were around 2,000 barrels. That's where we were for most of the space. We got up to 3,000 before we turned on our new space. there's a lot of things you can do if you are strategic with your contracts and your relationships. And I think it really it works in your favor to consider how big you want to be and make relationships associated with that. So we knew that we were looking to cap out at around the 6,000 barrel mark. And that's assuming, maybe we open another space, maybe we just do a little bit more wholesale. I don't want to get into the regional brewery size. I don't feel like that's true to our core identity. So we made relationships with hop providers and hop brokers that were smaller. So Hollingberry is where most of our hops are sourced from. We source strata from indie hops. We have a little bit of contracts through YCH and BSG, and we spread it around so that we have relationships when we need them. And so it's also hard. Some hop brokers have proprietary hops that you can't get from other ones. Knowing that we were in that space, Hollingberry and Indy in particular were really great with us with sending out remote selections for those years. Or we could before that, we also reached out to friends and said, hey, we're not big enough to select. You guys are selecting. I trust your palate on this. Like, we just did that with Ghost Town this year. We don't select Simcoe. We're not doing enough Simcoe. So I texted Justin at Ghost Town. I was like, hey, can we bounce off your contract? I trust your Simcoe selection. And he was cool with it. So we did it. It's about playing relationships and looking at like what your goals are. And again, honestly, just trying to form relationships around that. And it's helped us a lot over the past 8 years. The first 2 years, I think, was Lupulin Exchange over contracting with bad hop brokers that are no longer in business. And then we learned all those lessons, and we've been much better off since then.
Can I comment
Oh,
on that?
yeah. You comment on that, Jake.
I would piggyback on that and say from if I was starting Westbound Down over again. So I did a couple things in hindsight that were smart and a couple really dumb things. Just if you're dedicated to make, obviously there's people here that are just like, oh yeah, I got a meal, have to be here. We're not going to be an IPA focused brewery. If so, ignore everything I'm getting ready to say. But if you are, I learned in the last 3 years that a lot of the smaller Pacific Northwest breweries are just kind of showing up in Yakima at hop selection and kind of forcing their way into selection. Didn't know that was a thing. The smart thing I did was had very good friends at Coors and Oscar Blues that had some unbelievable hop contracts and were rooting for me and Westbound Down, and that saved us. 2015, it was the opposite of right now where people are like pulling Citra out of the ground because there's too much of it. It was like Citra was like $34 a pound. And, if you were starting a brewery, they're like, we'll give you a Cascade. And if you buy enough of it, we might give you a Chinook. And you're like, man, we are fucked. Like, sorry for the language, but that is literally the thought process of like, I'm trying to open a hop focused brewery and I've got 2 hops that were important in 2005 to open with. And then those relationships really, saved us. We were getting amazing Amarillo, Galaxy, Citra, Simcoe, Mosaic from these sources. But what I didn't know is, like I said, that there are a lot of these smaller producers. Like at this point, honestly, BSG will let you select. I'm pointing because Ben's in the back and I think they're a sponsor. And I didn't use this and they didn't offer it when I was this small. But you can just like go select a couple 100 pounds with them. And between that and just taking spot market hops, do it. Like learn what your ingredients are. Find out who the farmers are. If you can, send beer to the actual farmers, not the pelletizers, and make relationships with these people. Like if you're going to make a hop focused brewery, this is the main show. So understanding it top to bottom, understanding the people that make it, getting any insight on better lots, any insight on, how the hops you select in this season are producing and whether you should be, telling people at selection, hey, I want to be like early mid harvest. I want to be just strictly early harvest. I want to be late harvest. These are all things you can learn by having friends at the farms, having friends, throughout the process. So I think invest a ton of time in those relationships, both with other brewers like Sean talked about and with the farmers. And then if you can't do any of those things, look for small producers. Hophead Farms, not a sponsor to my knowledge, but they're an example of a very small group out of Michigan. They grow some Michigan-grown hops. Not here to necessarily promote those because other than their Michigan-grown saws, we don't use a ton of them. But if you're too small to select, they select their Mosaic, Citra, and Simcoe blend. Full disclosure, we use none of those products, but in a pinch, we have. And if you don't get to select, people like that who are making their own hop blend is the next closest thing you can do, and is certainly a better choice than just taking whatever's available on the spot market on Lupulin or wherever else. If you do, you're kind of subject to whatever you get. And the other version is you get to go out and find what you need to make the beer you have a vision for. And if I could do it again, that's what I would change, is didn't have that foresight to think that through.
For sure. I've loved that. I've had conversations with brewers like, we did a collab with so-and-so, and I loved their selection of this hop. And so I got the lot number, and then I reached out to my hop broker and I was like, can I get some of this lot of that? And, if they have more, there you go. All of a sudden you haven't selected yourself, but you've connected with a lot that you definitely have a positive reaction to and want to use in that. And so, there are ways to kind of triangulate around some of those limitations, of selection.
Totally.
Sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about hop products. As I said at the top, we are in an unprecedented period where technology around hops is progressing at a rate that we've never seen in history before. What are some of the more advanced hop products that get you excited? What are some, that you have tried that, maybe, don't reach the excitement level? And, are there techniques then in using hops that you have found, that can equate to some of these hop products? Anyway, let's talk about this kind of advanced approach to hop products. Why don't you start, Marnie?
Well, I have not used a lot of the flowables. I do really like the cryo hops. I think that they add a lot of value, especially for the cold side, and being able to get your yields and volume that you'd like with the finished product, and also being able to use a little bit, because you are using a little bit less but getting more from it. Sitting on this panel tonight, I would like to check out some of the Incognito and Spectrum that Sean has talked about, definitely. But I feel like what we've done here with dry hopping and getting our yields, we do like using the cryo hops, and prefer using the more of the T90s on hot side, or I would say mostly in the Whirlpool. That's where most of the hops go, and then hitting it with cryo on cold side. Some T90s go in there as well, but there are so many. Also, they're getting the fresh frozen as well. Used a little bit of that.
Fresh frozen? You have cans of that right here, right?
Yeah. Those are actually Roy Farms. They do the Harvest Fresh pellets, so those weren't the fresh frozen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they essentially harvest the hops, and from there go to the curing. Once they're kilned and on the curing floor, and they don't go into bales in general at Roy Farms. They go directly to pellets, so it's a little bit different than most of the hop growers out in Yakima and Oregon as well. And so that's kind of the name behind that, is their Harvest Fresh pellets. So yeah, the fresh frozen is actually a fresh hops that have been frozen. And were you talking about that it's flowable, the from New Zealand?
I don't know that they've actually released what that proprietary thing is
Oh,
the Sub-Zero hop
you
keep.
can't
So
talk
that,
about
yeah, I
it.
have no idea. I can't talk. I don't know what it is, but it's not. It's definitely not a fresh hop product.
Okay. Yeah. So there are frozen fresh hop available through YCH. It's a 702 number that you can get on some specific hops to give kind of like that, like a wet hop, fresh hop IPA.
Sure, Jake, when it comes to advanced hop products, where are you at?
So I think this ties into maybe a couple things. If I were opening a brewery, I would think about, I know that came up in the last panel, Westbound and Down, or myself in general, have been involved on a couple panels with cryo products from YCH, and then again with CGX, which is effectively the same product from Crosby hops out of Oregon. And, you know, the most recent one was CGX. It was us and Breakside. And, you know, when we use hop products, we use them to push the limits. Everybody that uses, you know, that markets hop products will tell you about yields and savings and these things. And this may speak to more of character flaws in myself than anything to do with those hop products, but we just see those as chances to make absurd hoppy beers.
Your CFO must love you.
Luckily, I'm also the CFO, so no oversight on that. But so like that's how we approach most hop products. Like we have beers we make. I think if you're designing new beers, you can design them around these new products, but the substitutions that are advertised, I don't think really play out. You know, they'll try to say cryo is 2-to-1. Sure. I mean, if you're making a new beer, you can factor that in as a jumping off point. But I think if you were to take a core beer, your, you know, hypothetical brand that already exists makes, and try to implement cryo 2-to-1 for the hop, you will not be making the same beer. We use the equation of 1.5-to-1, I think is more honest. But even with that, it's not, they really aren't substitutes. It's just a different weapon in your kind of arsenal. That being said, I think, you know, like if you're developing a new business plan, and we've talked about how important IPA is to craft beer, there is a strategy in potentially avoiding it, because these are, like, I can say across our bar, they're not the most profitable beers we make per ounce. They're the most volume, which there's a different business strategy around volume. But if you were to say how you make the most beer, well, craft beer and IPA push the price boundary. And then there's a lot of other beer styles that get to follow closely behind that because of that boundary pushing. And those beer styles, for us at least, tend to, not by volume and not by dollars made per year, but per ounce, are more profitable. So Westbound and Down's history is not a good one to show how hop product can make you more money. They're actually just a way we light money on fire to have tons of fun. But, you know, that being said, there's a business strategy in that too, which is that, you know, I think our customer base is along for the ride on that. They're like, yeah, these guys make great hoppy beer all the time. And when they make one-off beer, like, we're going to be on that journey with them. So that's kind of our approach to these hop products, which is, like I said, the guys at Crosby thought it was hilarious because Breakside did all these analogies of, you know, Ben is a good buddy, all this studies on yields and things that their sales team wanted. And I was like, yeah, we ignored all that and just put a ton of it in there, and we love this beer. And we, you know, barely made money doing it, but we had a blast. And that was kind of our takeaway.
Rock and roll, rock and roll. Well, we've been talking a long time up here. Does anyone have questions out there? The question is, what is the next trend in IPA?
Saison. I just said it. I'm just kidding. It's not. That's not true at all. That's
Damn
not
it,
true at all.
Sean. Damn it, Sean.
No, I don't know. I guess to circle back to what we were talking a little bit before, I guess a two-minded approach. Part of me does not think about it, because I think if you're thinking through to the next trend, that's your focus. And you need, in my opinion, you should be focused on what you're currently making, how you can make it, like, I don't know. I think if you can make a hazy IPA or a West Coast IPA and make the best example of that style, you will do better than any of your competitors. If you're thinking about what's next, you're skipping a lot of steps, and there's a lot of pitfalls to that. And I think there's a lot of risk. You could hit on something. You could hit that jackpot. I don't know what that is. I know if I go to the other side, I think where we're headed at least is a lot of the things that we're learning from IPA, both East Coast, West Coast, we're translating that to lager production and doing the same thing Jake was talking about, where we make lager and we put far too many hop products in that. But I think it's kind of that movement of the new movement of the West Coast IPA, where we're really looking for that super crisp expression with as much hop flavor as you can possibly impart into a glass. And that's what we're really trying to do. So that's where we're focused. And at the same time, also really like we're pretty new to West Coast IPA, honestly, like 18 months in on trying to really work on that. So that's a big focus for us right now. Not really thinking about what's beyond that, but just trying to get that as dialed in as we're able to.
Do either of you have some thoughts on that?
I kind of just look at it interplaying. Everything that we do here, we're selling over the bar. I don't have to worry about packaging like these two here do, and so I don't have to worry about fan and stuff like that. I like to kind of enjoy the ride with our guests that come in and see what's kind of vibing with them, and what they're drinking, what I'm excited about. And I think that works really well. It's kind of this unspoken interplay that you get to have, this journey that we're all on together. And everything's changing all the time, being able to be brewing and selling over the bar, changing things on the fly like that is pretty great. And that's kind of the way I do it here. So.
Two different answers to that. One, I think, riffing off what Sean said, I think business aside, find out the beers you want to make, and it's hard until you do it for a long time. I had the privilege of, making beer for 6 or 7 years before Westbound opened professionally. But finding out the voice and the vision and like the beer in your head you want to put out there that you want to drink and make that. And I think the trends, will come to you with that beer, or the fan base will, because I think authenticity to what you want to do is, what makes this unique, right? Like if this was just all business, just, sell commercial real estate or packaged toothpaste, or it doesn't really matter, right? Like we're all in this room because it's more fun than doing the other bullshit. So do that first, because if not, there's a lot of easier ways to make money than being at this seminar or making beer. That first. But then two, if I were to say if there's a trend, I think there has been a huge trend, which macro beer figured out a long time ago. And then we all fought against it, and now it's coming back to. And everything I do in West Coast IPA seems to follow that, which is drinkable beer made with Pilsner malt. In some cases, our West Coast IPA is also made with lager yeast. Some cases not, but even then it's fermented cold. And when you go through the process, it's basically like, how can we jam all these hop characters we're obsessed with into a beer that ultimately drinks as easy as light lager or Pilsner? Pilsner probably being the better vehicle for this metaphor. So I do think there is this trend, which had already been figured out and craft beer pushed against, that people just want to drink beer. Like everyone got into drinking beer because they enjoyed the feeling they had drinking beer. So you need to be able to drink a handful of them. So I do think there is this overarching trend back towards drinkability, regardless of beer style. And I think, that is why West Coast IPA is having its moment. This, I called it Wave 3, New West Coast, I think is a craft beer and brewing term. But regardless of any of this, I just think we're moving back towards beers that are just really consumable. And then they have this huge hop characteristic, which makes them different from, macro lager. But otherwise, we're talking about like how can you drink 4? You know, how can you drink 3 or whatever you deem responsible or not, or however you figure that out. But that, I think, is the trend that I see, is just how do you make beer fun and consumable again while having these other attributes that make them unique and have your own voice and make people connect with a brand while they're paying money for it. So I think if you combine all those things, that's, you know, our goal at Westbound. How do you make beer fun, consumable, and then also weave in our voice? If you can knock all 3 of those out of the park, you hit a grand slam.
Building flavorful beer that you can also drink in quantity, that is the gold standard, right? That's what we all want to do here in this business. Unfortunately, we don't have more time to talk even deeper about this, but thank you, Sean, Jake, Marnie, for your thoughts on brewing IPA. It's been wonderful to talk to you all about this now. There it is, our discussion on IPA from the recent Brewery Accelerator in Denver, Colorado. That was just the one of dozen panel discussions and informational sessions that make up the Accelerator, along with working group sessions, technical tours, lightning pitches, and much more. If you're contemplating opening a brewery, visit breweryworkshop.com for information about the 2023 Accelerator in Austin, Texas. And with that, we bring this episode to a close. G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, and reliability with 24/7 service and support. BSG is North America's exclusive distributor of Environment specialty malts. Try Old Orchard's flavored craft juice concentrate blends in your next craft beverage. AccuBrew helps you detect problems before they ruin a batch. ProBrew has rotary can fillers in stock with a 2 to 4 week lead time. Omega stylized yeast bring intense guava and passion fruit aromas out of your malt and hops. If you're a pro brewer, request your free samples today from the Perfect Puree and Varieties supply from Yakima Chief Hops has the dankest hop t-shirts, hats, socks, pins, and more. Of course, if you've enjoyed this episode and any others, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, and become a subscriber to one or both of our magazines and more. We appreciate your support, and that's what helps us bring you this podcast every week. We'll be back next week for another in-depth brewing conversation. Until then, cheers. This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.